Good morning from an atypically sunny London. My name's Steve Bailey. I'm an analyst with a company called Omdia. And today I'm going to be taking you through a presentation about the defining themes of the console market. Now, consoles are a somewhat unique hardware group in the games landscape in that they are specialist devices dedicated primarily to the act of playing games and have been active for over 30 years now. And in that time, people would often claim that the days of consoles are numbered, that consoles are dinosaurs due to die out and be replaced by smartphones, tablets, whatever. But that hasn't happened. Instead, we have Nintendo Switch setting new sales records, and the new Xbox and PlayStation machines can't be manufactured quickly enough to meet demand. So we're going to talk about the value and appeal of consoles through the lens of several key topics. And those topics will be split into two groups. The first group looks at the outgoing generation of hardware, that is the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. These released in 2013, and as is typical for consoles, their sales start to decline about 5 years or so after launch, at which point they are replaced by an incoming generation of consoles. In this instance, the PS5 and the new Xbox Series S and X. It's this incoming generation which will then define our second group of topics. So as we said, let's begin by looking at the outgoing generation. And our first topic is about the industrious use of back catalogues. Sales of back catalogue games have become increasingly important for publishers in the past 10 years. And a number of mid-sized publishers have seen record results on the back of making greater use of their older games. And some publishers now even employ legacy portfolio managers purely to take care of this function, this side of the business. On the screen, what you see here is the share of each platform's game catalogue that was being sold at a discount via the first-party download stores around the end of December last year. So on PS4, for example, around 1,000 games and bundles, that's about 1/5 of the catalogue, was being sold via discount. And that share is even higher on Xbox and Switch. This is now very common for consoles. In the space of a generation, we've seen digital discounting go from an occasional thing to a constant and pronounced part of the offering. Some of this discounting is now quite extreme, up to 98 or 99% off the resting price, often making these games cheaper than the equivalent of those being sold on a disc in a box. But it's not just about discounting. It's about making full use of that catalogue, that old catalogue of games. Publishers have become much less protective of the launch value of content within certain series and franchises, and instead understand that it's perhaps worth giving older content away for free if it acquires customers for your newer titles and brings players into your ecosystem. In the olden days, let's say pre-2010 or so, launching a game console was almost a fire and forget experience. You would launch a game for $50, $60, whatever, and there would be this intense but narrow window of sales. And after that window closed, with the exception of certain franchises, commercial activity would drop off a cliff. It was really kind of do or die, incredibly front-loaded, but thanks to digital, the current console marketplace has a longer tail to it, and with that, a broader and healthier sense of opportunity. Our second topic is that of digital-only hardware, and by that, I mean consoles that can only play games downloaded via an internet connection and won't take any discs or physical media. 2019 saw the launch of the first mainstream digital-only TV console, the Xbox One S All-Digital Edition. And it's a hardware tier that we expect to become a standard part of the console offering from here on out. But here's the thing with that. Consoles started implementing digital-only game catalogues as far back as 2004, starting with Xbox Live Arcade, and then expanding to include digital versions of packaged games in around 2009 onward. Indeed, this idea of digital-only game content is now very common on all console formats. So why was there such a large gap between this and the launch of digital-only machines? Part of the reason is that Xbox attempted to introduce something similar to a digital-only console as far back as 2013 with the launch of the Xbox One. The console was unveiled at a pre-launch event in around May of that year, and it pitched the device as requiring an internet connection and for games discs to activate licenses rather than represent any traditional sense of ownership, effectively positioning it as an all-digital device. But the problem with that is that Xbox tried to pitch this as compulsory and did so to an early adopter audience. And both of those things backfired, meaning there was a cooling period before the topic could be visited again. Now, this illustrates the care with which you have to approach the console audience, especially your enthusiast users. This is an audience that you need to appease in order to give your new console its earliest momentum. And you don't do that by changing the proposition significantly and telling them it's compulsory. No matter the wider technological trends, you have to balance any such progression with the needs of this highly engaged and well-established audience of players who've been playing console games possibly for decades. So digital-only consoles could have happened quite some time before 2019, but they needed to be offered as an option alongside consoles with disk drives, rather than lumped onto the player base as a sudden obligation. This is a really good example of the kinds of balancing acts that consoles need to be constantly thinking about. And in this example, it's a case of balancing progression with tradition. Our third topic is the rise and fall of Mixer. You might remember that Mixer was a user-driven video streaming platform similar to something like Twitch that was bought by Microsoft in 2017 and was symbolic of its intentions to develop itself as a competitor in the game space. These kinds of platforms define a lot of the modern opportunity around marketing and community in games. And Microsoft's ownership of Mixer would mean that it could be integrated more closely into its own platforms, especially Xbox One and Xbox Live. More than that, I presume that Mixer was planned to become a jumping-off point for Microsoft's cloud gaming platform, in the same way that YouTube and Twitch could be used for Google Stadia and Amazon's Luna, respectively. However, despite that opportunity, running such a platform can be a deceptively complex act, as you can see from this diagram on the screen. On the surface, enabling video streaming coverage for games might seem like a simple endpoint, but actually implementing that kind of thing involves a great number of stakeholders and a lot of layers. It also involves hitting a certain scale of audience in order to offer the kind of return needed to drive such a platform when it comes to appealing to the brands and star influences that you have to have on board. So Microsoft closed Mixer in 2020 and then decided instead to partner with Facebook Gaming in the hope that Facebook could provide both the needed scale and the influx of new users into Xbox's ecosystem. What this illustrates is that consoles can't do everything in-house. They can't do everything by themselves. Sure, on the one hand, there's a way they can operate outside of certain trends, but on the other, there are certain regards in which they need to embrace the wider technological landscape. Again, it's another great example of the kind of balancing act that goes into operating a console. Our fourth topic, is about the maturing of a hybridized approach to how publishers make money from games. And by that, I mean it's become less and less common for games to focus on a single business model, certainly in terms of how, say, AAA games and free-to-play games sell themselves on console. So this maturing has been happening for quite some time and means that even traditional single-player games like Devil May Cry 5, as you can see from this slide here, now have very complicated life cycles where the publisher switches from one approach to another and back again as befits the opportunity. This is an important facet of game consoles, right? You have an audience that is used to using multiple business models and distribution methods. That gives publishers room to create all kinds of different approaches to their games. So just to labor that point, we have some further examples of this complexity on the screen here. So on the left, you have GTA 5 and Overwatch, games that even after years on the market can still charge a premium entry point, even though they both still monetize their direct multiplayer experiences via microtransactions. In the middle, you have two games that were premium for a good number of years and have now switched to free to play, and monetization via expansion content and season passes. And on the right, you have the two of the biggest free to play experiences on console, Apex Legends and Fortnite, both of which have released packaged special editions to capitalize on a certain section of the audience that likes to buy content in such a format. A lot of free-to-play games these days indeed launch with premium adjacent offerings in the form of special editions, founders editions, and so on. Part of the issue with free-to-play is that it's often seen as a business model, and it's not. It's a way of accessing games that can have profound implications for game design, for marketing, for distribution, and monetization, but it is not in itself a business model. It's, in fact, a collection of business models, and the same applies to premium games. That's why the picture is more complicated than it first appears, and helps explain why consoles, despite being very old, are actually quite stable and adaptable. Now, as we can see from this chart here, which covers most of the past decade, this is spend on console content and services, premium spend in light blue, subscriptions in pink, and expansions, premium DLC, etc. in purple. Now, subs and DLC have been part of the landscape for years now, exhibiting gradual rather than explosive growth, and that's going to remain the case for the future. What you'll see is a marketplace that offers a balanced approach to how console players are monetized, where subscription will become a significant and complementary part, a net positive, but doesn't obliterate the rest of the landscape. Okay. So, with that in mind, let's move on to the incoming generation and the topics that we feel will define the next few years for consoles, such as PlayStation 5, Nintendo Switch, and the Xbox Series. First, let's look at the topic of generations. By generation, we mean that there is a cycle at work. A games console launches and gains momentum across the space of 4 or 5 years, and then hits a peak, and then goes into decline, and sells fewer units each year until it's eventually succeeded by a follow-up console. This idea of generations is still very important, but seems to be poorly represented. Over the past 10 years, we've showed time and again that generations are ending, that console hardware will no longer progress in jumps. But that's how it's stayed, and that's how it's likely to stay for most of the coming decade. This chart here shows the annual sales volume for console from PlayStation, from Nintendo, and from Xbox, and covers a 25-year period. And you can see over the past 20 years some very obvious cycles in effect. There's definitely a strong pattern at work here. Nintendo is where the pattern is least obvious. Thanks to the impact of the Wii U, that was its 2012 console that struggled to sell. And it essentially curtailed the typical duration of the generation, meaning that the Switch launched in 2017 instead of hitting, say, 2019 or 2020, like the most recent installments of PlayStation and Xbox. People are once again saying that this generational transition is going to be slower, more protracted, because players have less reason or desire to upgrade. And I would disagree and say that if it wasn't for the hardware shortages and the impact of an unprecedented event like the COVID pandemic, we'd actually see a transition happening at a similar rate to periods in the past. Thinking back to 2013, which is when the PS4 and the Xbox One launched, there was a lot of talk about how the transition would be a lot slower, about how the improvements in new consoles were less tangible and less important. And to help facilitate that more gradual transition, major titles like Call of Duty, Battlefield, etc., offered cross-generational upgrades. PlayStation 2 launched its own cross-play, cross-save, cross-buy initiatives. But if you fast forward from that point to 2015, every publisher we talked to was taken aback with how quickly the generation had transitioned. So this expected slowing didn't really happen. So it's not outrageous to suggest that the same thing would happen again. And from that perspective, I think something like the Xbox Series S variant, a cheaper stepping stone into the next generation, is arguably more of an experiment than a necessity at this phase in the generation. Now, this next chart shows just how many years consoles continue to sell after they've been succeeded. The blue shows how many years each console was the primary offering. That is, it was the latest and best machine available from that manufacturer. And the pink shows how many years after it was succeeded that it continued to sell over 100,000 units per year. Once it sells less than 100,000 per year, we consider it discontinued for the sake of this graph. And I think people tend to be surprised by this in how quickly consoles fade from sales activity. The PS2 had a lot of time in the sun thanks to the console discovering a long tail of activity in emerging territories around the world. But apart from that, I wouldn't say there's a huge change over the years in that ratio of the pink to the blue. Perhaps the pink portion is becoming slightly larger over time, but this is a 25-year picture. And what we're seeing here, I think, goes against this idea that hardware generations are dying out. So a question that follows on from that is, what share of unit sales happens when a console is the primary offering, which is in the blue, versus what happens when it's been succeeded, which is in the pink? And I think the picture is even starker here, illustrating just how much of the console buying tends to taper off once a new machine enters the picture. Now, with the PS5 and the Xbox Series X console selling for $500, there is the possibility of this picture changing for them because they could enact a much greater extent of price drop later in their life cycle, in their twilight, extending that pink area towards something more akin to the PlayStation 2 than the PS3 or the PS4. So this idea of generations doesn't just apply to hardware, of course, but also to content and to services. And when we say content, we just talk about the games themselves. How much distinction is there on the content front between generations? And this is a part of the picture that's becoming more fluid. On screen, what you have here is a measure of content overlap between hardware generations. So we can see that for Xbox, the overwhelming majority of the available game catalog works on both old and new consoles. But for PlayStation, the overlap is much smaller. Now, this data is based on store listings, so the PlayStation figure is actually going to be a bit higher, as there are a number of PS4 games that also work on PS5 that are not listed as such on the stores themselves. But I think what you see here is still an effective indicator, as it illustrates the respective intentions of the manufacturers. This overlap is something that Xbox has been deliberately working towards for the past 5 years, whereas for PlayStation, it's a more recent endeavor. We often get asked whether this idea of cross-generational functionality will cause the hardware transition to slow down or to speed up. And I think it does neither of those things. What it does offer is protection. It keeps people in your ecosystem. It keeps players on your machines. That's the important thing with backwards and cross-generational compatibility. If new hardware is in short supply, it means your old platform still has a strong content supply. And if someone buys the new hardware, but new exclusive content isn't ready yet, then updated versions of fan favorite games keep them active on your new hardware. It's about the ecosystem play, basically. And that brings us neatly to our second topic for the incoming consoles. And we'll start by talking about something we've referred to plenty of times already, which is balancing acts. Over the years, it's been very easy to dismiss consoles as outdated, to call them dinosaurs, say that they're about to die out, but they are still here and they are still going strong. And that's because they are this deceptively complex collection of balancing acts and quite adaptable with it. 10 years ago, people were saying that cloud gaming would kill consoles, but now consoles are one of the best places to explore the potential of cloud gaming. Apple TV was supposed to kill consoles, but didn't. Steam boxes were supposed to kill consoles, but didn't, likely because the manufacturers realized how difficult it was to pull off the right balance between price, performance, evolution, accessibility, and so on. Now, consoles are not invincible, of course, They are always ripe for disruption, but their ability to represent multiple forms of distribution and business model can make them resistant, along with an audience that is highly engaged and happy to spend a lot of money. Next, we look at how the messaging has changed in recent years by manufacturers when it comes to how they approach facets of their respective ecosystem. PlayStation remains the most balanced, and I don't think there's much to be said there on that front, at least not compared to Xbox and Nintendo. So let's start with Xbox. Xbox has been putting great emphasis on its content library subscriptions, Game Pass and Xbox Live Ultimate in recent years, drawing that conversation away from hardware somewhat and signaling a change of emphasis for the company. Now, this change makes sense for Xbox. What we have here is the total number of consoles sold over the past 20 years by manufacturer. And this is not to disparage Xbox, you understand. Launching a console takes billions of dollars and a staggering amount of effort. And to sell this many machines it's an enormous achievement indeed. But it's an area where Xbox is unlikely to see much growth. And this helps explain its change of emphasis into a services-driven arena as a company. It's an area where it has much greater experience and potential, and it's attempting to get a head start on the future and aiming to arrive there before its rivals do. So Xbox's Game Pass strategy has three distinct phases. The first is the short-term phase, which was between launch in 2016 and 2020, where the object was to reframe the conversation around Xbox, in which I think it has been very successful. Then you have the long-term goal from 2025 onward, where Game Pass and Ultimate aim to drive the bulk of Xbox's console business. It's a vision that's coherent and to which the company has made a huge commitment. However, we still have this middle phase between now and 2024. And in that phase, the company has to continue selling hardware and really start delivering on its first-party software in order to scale up that audience for Game Pass and Xbox Live Ultimate. Anyway, if you want to know more about subscription and cloud, a colleague of mine named George Gigiashvili is running a separate talk at GDC on those very topics. Next up, we'll take a look at Nintendo, whose strategy, by its own admission, has become hardware-focused again. For my money, that is a shift away from when the console launched, and it seemed to be shifting more emphasis onto Nintendo Switch Online. But when it comes to the use of Switch Online, people are asking, why is Nintendo not putting more and more weight behind the online service? But first of all, it's typical of Nintendo doing its own thing at its own pace. Few companies have the strength of IP that Nintendo does, and it's preferring to exercise control over its ecosystem while it still can. For now, that means prioritizing getting people onto Switch hardware first and foremost. Arguably, this is going to change, especially towards the latter half of the hardware cycle, when the successor to Switch is lining up for release. And I think at that point, it will become a priority to shift people into an online ecosystem, as that makes it easier then to migrate them between generations of hardware. Now, there's an interesting thing happening when it comes to this idea of ecosystems. And it's the more seamless things become for consumers, the more complicated they become behind the scenes. Subscription and cloud may simplify the offering for consumers, but behind the scenes, things actually get much more difficult to track and to implement. It's why this ideal of people being able to play whatever they want, whenever they want, on whatever device they want, is a long-term challenge that's going to take many years to solve. And so one big part of the problem there is where is a player acquired? Where are they retained? Where are they monetized? And these potentially now become very fragmented questions that make things a lot more difficult from an operational standpoint. To put it more generally, across the next decade, the business is entering its third wave of complexity. Not just console, but I think the entire market. And I'm not really sure if we're really ready for it. It's obviously nice to talk about this unified, seamless offering for consumers, but the tensions between companies and platforms in terms of who owns the IP, who owns the user experience, who owns the infrastructure, is only just beginning. There are going to be lots of clashes and fights over this in the coming decade. And I think Apple versus Epic is just the beginning. Anyway, we're not going to dig into that too much further here. We're going to move on to the third topic, which is Heartlands. Now, there are some very interesting battles taking place when it comes to the key regions in the console marketplace, such as in the US between Xbox and PlayStation. As you can see here, we have the install base, which is the number of consoles sold by generation across the past 20 years, and how PlayStation weighs off against Xbox there. Now, the US is the biggest console market in the world. It's also the main stronghold for Xbox. It's where Xbox 360 pushed ahead some 10 years ago, and it's where Xbox One held the most steady, despite the challenges that the format faced. So the question is, what's going to happen next? We're currently forecasting PlayStation and Xbox as neck and neck, but there's obviously a major tussle taking place here. PlayStation is now headquartered in the US, and is aligning itself with big Western brands such as Spider-Man. If PlayStation can hurt Xbox here, it could limit the growth that Xbox has ahead of it for the next 3 or 4 years. Conversely, of course, Xbox has shored up its position in the US via acquisitions, like when Xbox bought Bethesda recently for many billions of dollars. All the headlines were about Xbox bulking out Game Pass, which is completely true. But there's also this matter of reinforcing its position in the US. We should not overlook that. On a similar note, let's look at Europe, which remains a challenge for Xbox because both historically and arguably in the near future, the cachet of PlayStation remains just too strong for it to make much of a dent in things. But again, this could explain the value of a services-first approach from Xbox. A different tack might end up giving it the kind of traction in Europe that hardware is failing to generate for it. Finally, we have Japan. And this time we're looking at PlayStation versus Nintendo. And we're also including handheld here because Japan is very mobile oriented. One thing to keep in mind here is that since we don't have a full cycle picture for PS5, we've used the PS4's lifetime install base. And it tells us that even if PS5 sells as well as PS4, this encroachment from Nintendo will still continue. So could we perhaps see a future where Japan, one of the biggest console markets in the world, becomes the exclusive playground of Nintendo? And finally, we touch on the topic of curation and discoverability. Oh, excuse me. Here on the screen, we have a 3-year picture of what's been happening on Nintendo Switch in terms of content released digitally onto the platform. The blue bar shows how many games have been released on the platform, which was around 700 games in May 2018 or so. That was just 1 year after release. I thought this unprecedented volume would slow down, but it's just kept that release rate ever since, recently hitting 5,000 titles, which is a record for a games console. We also have the pink line, which shows the percentage of the game catalog that's under $20 at any given moment. So at any given time in the past 3 years, around 80% of the Switch's catalog is selling for under $20. It's a lot to have to compete with in terms of visibility if you're releasing a game onto the platform. The topic of discoverability remains critical for consoles because the manufacturers have to be able to demonstrate value to content partners. If you were going to release a game onto my machine, what return is there for you? What value? Why should you bother? Primarily, this is done via establishing an install base of hardware, which represents an audience of potential users and therefore buyers. But increasingly, with digital and connectivity facilitating so much game-related content, what's the point of releasing your game onto a platform if it just gets lost in the crowd? And it's not as if there aren't a growing number of alternative platforms out there to release your games onto. Again, it's one of many, many balancing acts that console manufacturers have to perform. Anyway, that brings this presentation to its end. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you found it enjoyable, or at least interesting. Have yourself a good GDC, and take care of yourselves out there in these crazy times. Bye bye.